We're live.
Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you to this latest webinar, one in the series. This one on the economic and political realities in Northeast Asia. I am Congressman John Doolittle, a former member of Congress from California, and involved in these issues now for a number of years. And I was asked to moderate the webinar today. We have a distinguished panel with us today, all individuals with whom I am certainly familiar and acquainted as well. And I'd like to welcome, first of all, someone who's always impressed me with her background and her knowledge of the issues and just her capabilities, and that is Ms. Chihoko Goto, who's the Deputy Director for Geoeconomics and Senior Associate for the Northeast Asia Program at the within the Wilson Center's Asia Program. She is a leading expert on economics and politics in Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea, as well as US policy in the region. She's a seasoned journalist and analyst, and she spent 10 years reported from Tokyo and Washington for both Dow Jones and the UPI on the global economy, international trade, and Asian markets and politics. She's a contributing editor to The Globalist. Ms. Goto previously worked for the World Bank and has been awarded fellowships from the East-West Center and the Knight Foundation, among others. And she's fluent in Japanese, and I believe I saw French. So welcome, please, Ms. Goto, and we're so pleased that you could be with us today.
Thank you very much, Congressman. It's really a great honor and it gives me great pleasure to be part of this very distinguished panel. I think there's been a lot of very exciting discussions today, but the panel today focusing on economics, I think, is particularly poignant as we look forward to trying to decipher what's going to happen next in a region that is fraught with tension, but also with great opportunities as well. That said, I believe we've reached a point where we actually have some clarity on where we stand today. In the paraphrasing Donald Rumsfeld, there are, of course, the known knowns, the known unknowns, and perhaps there's greater clarity in some of the knowns and the unknowns at the moment. So what are the knowns? We are now able to identify some of the common grounds that unify the United States with its key allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. And the biggest one of them all is actually to have a united stance on China as we stand now. That is actually not an easy task to do. There had been a lot of concern in Asia about the election of President Biden. Although President Trump had an unusual approach to foreign policy, to say the least, his stance in taking a more hardline view on China was particularly welcomed by Japan. And there was concern that a Biden administration would be much more dovish and therefore go against what Tokyo was hoping for when it in confronting the China challenge. So when we see the G7 leaders in Cornwall 2 weeks ago, sharing the White House's view and Japan's view about taking a much more aggressive stance towards some of the gross violations of the economic architecture of the liberal international order, everything from forced technology transfers to unfair industrial subsidies. This really was a uniting force, and this actually gives greater opportunity for cooperation amongst like-minded nations. I think we're also on the same page as in identifying some of the challenges that China poses moving forward. As you may recall, China joined the WTO in 2001. The expectation at that time would be that China would want to be part of the international order that currently existed. that kind of narrative and expectation no longer persists. China has its own values, not least its so-called dual circulation strategy, which is really containing within its own framework an ability to produce and distribute and consume goods within its own borders. It's come up with its own development assistance strategy, most notably through the Belt and Road Initiative. And although the United States likes to say that China has no allies per se, unlike the United States, that's really only true on the security front. In actual fact, China actually has a strong network of partners. They may be coerced, but certainly they do have that common approach that unites a lot of countries, especially in emerging markets. And then the third and final point that actually can be identified as common ground is that trade is no longer a flashpoint for relations between the United States and its allies, even though the United States continues to impose trade tariffs, especially in the steel and aluminum sector. That hasn't really prevented countries from working together with the United States. Most notably, we've seen that in coordination with the US Treasury to come up with a global corporate tax rate that will have a minimum threshold of 15%. And this has been approved by the G7, and we're expecting that to move forward with the G20 as well. So, but what are the unknowns? What are some of the concerns moving forward so that we do have this baseline understanding about the China threat, but where do we diverge? One of the challenges, I think, that has been highlighted is through the Korean experience. Korea, when it actually became the source of the THAAD anti-ballistic missile system, and it actually allowed the THAAD system to be posed onto its own shores, China took direct and aggressive action towards it. It took economic sanctions against it, and it really crippled the Korean economy. And it's quite clear that Seoul continues to be deeply rattled by that experience. And so you see that, for instance, in the latest bilateral statements that came out between the United States and Korea, comparing that with the bilateral statement that came out between Japan and the United States earlier this year. You see, for instance, that Japan is really speaking with one voice with the United States and taking this anti-China stance. But Korea is much more focused on working together, at least publicly, on ensuring security in the Korean peninsula and really stepping away from criticizing or directly attacking China. So that is really the biggest challenge, this whole idea of decoupling. The G7, again, has set the tone about the China threat, but there is going to be this limit of being able to converge completely with the United States when it comes to dealing with China, because they haven't actually diverged completely from China either. I do want to point out that the United States too, although it has taken new initiatives such as introducing this minimum global corporate tax rate, in spite of all its rhetoric about being committed to open and free and fair trade, it's actually not part of any mega trade region, and it's really bucking the global trend. So in the Indo-Pacific region, we have not just one, but two big trade deals that are moving forward. One is the new version of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, called the CPTPP. What's really exciting about that is, although the United States is not part of it, it's actually moved forward with 11 countries. And not only that, the UK, post-Brexit, has actually made this formal bid to join the CPTPP. And that was in part with a lot of encouragement from Japan to shepherd the United Kingdom into joining this pact of like-minded countries. Other countries that are interested include Thailand, I'm sorry, not Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, South Korea, and the Taiwanese government as well. I'd really actually like to ask the congressman about this, but given that TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, is unlikely to be extended when it expires on July 1st, it's going to be really difficult for the United States to be able to join any new trade agreement, even if there were political will on Capitol Hill, which I think is deeply lacking at the moment. The second trade deal that is moving forward in Asia right now is RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that the United States was never part of, but China is the biggest participating country in it. It needs the approval of 10 out of the 15 member countries, and 4 have already signed on. And it's expected to go through by early 2022. Critics, especially in Washington, have said that RCEP is very low standard, but it has encouraged countries to work together for a common goal, including strengthening the regional supply chain. It's establishing a secretariat that should encourage countries to work together towards a common rule, common framework of trade rules, and also set standards for emerging issues as well, including digital trade. And by being outside of these trade deals, the United States is actually not part of the action, and that will really hurt US economic leadership and also US corporate interests as well. So why don't I leave it for now and turn it back to you.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate your presentation. Well, just for the audience, we'll have all the speakers make their initial remarks, and then we will get into questions. It's my pleasure now to introduce my friend and former colleague from the House of Representatives, the Honorable Cliff Stearns. It's fun to introduce Cliff. He's currently an executive director based in APCO Worldwide's Washington, D.C. office, and he serves as a member of APCO's International Advisory Council. Cliff served for 24 years in the United States House of Representatives with distinction and various committees, including oversight and investigations, where he chaired a subcommittee there, an important one, communications technology and the internet subcommittee. He's an electrical engineer by training, with a bachelor's degree in that. He started his own company. It became a very successful one. Worked at one point for CBS. So I didn't know that, Cliff. But anyway, he has a long resume and has a distinguished career entirely apart from his service in Congress, and of course, including his service in Congress. I noted that he was a captain in the United States Air Force and served 4 years as an aerospace project engineer, providing satellite reconnaissance in Vietnam, and he was awarded the Air Force Commendation Medal for distinguished service and meritorious achievement, and later received the Air Force Association W. Stewart Simonton Award, which is the highest honor presented to a civilian in the field of national security. So Cliff has an extensive background, and I'd like to welcome him now to our panel.
John, thank you very much. That was a very nice introduction. I'm reminded when I was introduced by a peanut farmer in a warehouse of about 600 peanut farmers. I stood up and the chairman of the conference, his name is John Fechterly, and he said, Cliff was born at a very early age in a hospital to be near his mother. Cliff, your turn. So with that short introduction, the shortest I've ever had, I went ahead and made my presentation. But I'm delighted to be here, sponsored by the Universal Peace Federation and the Washington Times Foundation, and to be on this panel with my good friend, Tom McDivitt, and of course, Ms. Goto, and yourself, John. You and I have been good friends for a long time. The topic this afternoon is the economic and political realities in Northeast Asia, and what can be done through creative diplomacy to mitigate the division between the North and South. It's a very challenging, and having been in South Korea a couple of times and on the DMZ, and I've been in China 3 or 4 times, I have sort of a little bit of on the ground feel, having talked to a lot of South Koreans. And I think there's some inescapable realities that make harmony very difficult for these two countries. They're very far apart. In my comments, I want to sort of focus on the political realities, which I can talk to pretty carefully, and also the economic realities. But perhaps some common sense that I'll bring to this discussion to try and break through and create some type of understanding of what we can do to move the two countries together. As all of you know, in the South operates one of the world's most advanced economies, while to its north is a military dictatorship that really keeps a very tight fist on the economy. The North continues to face challenges in food and nutrition among its other difficulties. And it's, we all know it's a planned economy, and market allocation is limited, and it's basically a centralized economy, and so it's not working. Of course, South Korea has a mixed economy, which includes a variety of private freedom operation combined with centralized economic planning and government regulation. Many of you should know that South Korea is a member of the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, the APEC, and the Asian Pacific Trade Agreement, the APTA. So to bring these two countries together is going to require great diplomatic skill. But of course, the US needs support of China, because to denuclearize North Korea, you're going to have to bring in China. I think the US and China both share, and as pointed out earlier, sort of a mutual objectives. Neither China nor the United States want to have a highly nuclearized country in North Korea. So there is perhaps an opportunity for China and the United States to come together to forge sort of a lasting understanding of what we can do to prevent this. Now, North Korea has been on the edge of collapse economically. If it hadn't been for China providing North Korea with essential aid, which incidentally is in violation of the Chinese certified, which they certified, the 2017 UN Security Council sanctions. So they're supposed to limit oil imports, minerals, seafood, and textile exports. So North Korea's economy is in despair, and really without the help of China, it would collapse. So that's something we should realize. But with the pandemic, oddly enough, trade to North Korea has even gone less and less amount because the whole pandemic has created a problem with trade, and North Korea is thrusting into a very escalating crisis. So there is an opportunity, I think, if we can work something out. The thing we should all realize, of course, is that China has unprecedented economic growth, which what this does is pave the way for expansion of huge amount of political influence in its neighbors in East Asia. Its economic rise has potentially profound implications for the balance of power on the Korean Peninsula and, of course, in all Northeast Asia. Therefore, any solution would involve China, who's providing this substance of food and coal and inventory for North Korea. But I think there is a chance to ameliorate the situation. And I think we should realize that there has to be leadership by President Biden. President Trump made a strong overture by actually stepping across the DMZ to try and create some kind of friendship at the top. But with Biden, he has to realize that he has in Congress a bipartisan support to work against China. To show this in perspective, just a couple of weeks ago, the Senate passed what's called the U.S. Innovation Competition Act of 2021. This is a bill for $250 billion. And what this does is provide U.S. semiconductor production, scientific research, works on developing artificial intelligence, space exploration, huge amounts of money. It was, I think that it was 2,400 pages, this bill was, and it was all set up and aimed at competing with China. So you can see the bill passed overwhelmingly with Democrats and Republicans. So what Biden faces in the Senate and certainly in the House is bipartisan support for not only competing with China, but for actually lots of legislation against China. In the Democrat side, they have a similar bill that is provided to do almost the same thing. It's called the Ensuring American Global Leadership and Engagement Act, the EAGLE Act. And an early draft of this is pretty much like the Senate, and it has the same kind of overriding objective is to compete with China. So therefore, the president really is in a tough spot because there's bipartisan hostility to China to work towards a solution, both economically and politically. But I think we can all agree that China needs support of the United States if they're going to work together to do something with North Korea. So they share objectives. I'm told that the Chinese have maintained a 3 no's. Perhaps other people can confirm this. The 3 no's are no war, no instability, no nukes. And so towards that end, if that is what really is true, the US needs China's support the denuclearizing of North Korea, and we have a shared objective. So towards that end, what I would like to briefly propose is a solution is to provide free trade, the start of free trade between North and South Korea with the help of the United States subsidizing and China also subsidizing to move it forward. President Xi Jinping just visited North Korea, I think a couple of weeks ago, sort of to celebrate their commitment of working together. So if in effect we can start this idea of free trade as a critical component to a viable package to move this forward, what we could do is in the end, stretch it out over a period of time that would include lifting sanctions, establishing diplomatic relations to normalize between North Korea and South Korea, and eventually work towards a shared of denuclearization of North Korea. So if they could start some kind of free trade between the two countries with the support of China and the United States, I think that would be successful to achieving ultimately a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and it would provide a well-being for 25 million North Korean people, and it's a testing case for superpowers to try and make this happen. I'll conclude by saying that what I said earlier, that China and North Korea show united fronts in certain aspects, and that is to try and denuclearize North Korea. And I think towards that end, we should work towards that objective. In the end, you can say to yourself, well, it may never happen. It's worth trying. And I think ultimately it's something that should be done. Thank you, John, for the opportunity for my opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I'm now pleased to welcome an old friend with whom I've worked a great deal over the years, Mr. Thomas P. McDivitt. Tom has been associated with the Washington Times now for a number of years and has played a really key role and has served as the president and CEO of the Times, and has prior to that as vice president. He was general manager before that of the magazine division. The Washington Times has really played an outsized role in Washington because it's one of the leading conservative newspapers in the United States and has been that since its founding in the early 1980s. And Tom has been part and parcel of this for most of that time. And he's very familiar with the issues in Northeast Asia, which he's worked on extensively. And I'm very pleased to welcome him today as a member of our panel, Mr. Tom McDivitt.
Thank you very much, Congressman Doolittle. It's great to see you again. And also Congressman Stearns. We were together in Korea, together with John too, in February of 2020, where we launched the International Association for Peace and Economic Development, along with the International Media Association for Peace, all within the World Summit 2020 program. That since that time, all through the pandemic, Dr. Jenkins, Dr. Walsh, and others have done an outstanding job of holding forums, hundreds of them, with hundreds of thousands of people and amazing speakers on this critical issue of the Asia Pacific area. And it's great to see Shihoko again. She's really quite a presence in Washington as an expert on Asia. And I so enjoy your work and the work of the Wilson Center. Our good friend, Ambassador Mark Green, I understand, is back there heading up the Wilson Center. And he did such a great job at IED and also overseas as an ambassador in Africa. I'd like to start with a little story. And it's based on the fact that next year, the Washington Times will be 40 years old. 1982, we were founded right after Reagan had taken office. And it was in our 25th anniversary, some 14 years ago, Dr. Jenkins and I worked on this with others. We had a packed house at the National Building Museum downtown, right by the Capitol, about 2,000 people. And we were getting ready to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Washington Times. And we were so happy. We had, at the time, former President George H.W. Bush was our keynote. And of course, our founder, Dr. Reverend Sun Myung Moon, and his wife, Dr. Hak John Moon, were there. And it was an amazing event. And the Times was flying high. Wes Pruden was our editor, and it was amazing. And as we were getting ready to introduce the keynote, the founder, that is Reverend Moon, the fire alarm went off. And it didn't stop. And we were told we had to evacuate the building. Like roughly 2,000 people had to go outside. Fortunately, it was a nice May 17th, 2007 was a nice afternoon, a nice evening. It was a nice evening. Fortunately, everybody came back in, and we started the program again with introducing, President Bush had already spoken, and we were introducing Reverend Moon. He gave a landmark speech. I'll never forget it. I keep a copy of it in my library. And in that speech, he made somewhat of a prediction or an announcement that we have now moved into the Pacific era, from the Atlantic era to the Pacific era. And it was fascinating. And he talked about the times, and of course, alluded to President Bush and family values and the core elements of civilizational strength of family and society. A number of years later, it was actually just a couple of years ago, again, our team was over in Nagoya, Japan, and Dr. Hak John Moon, who now heads up UPF after the founder passed away in 2012, she gave a landmark speech in Nagoya, Japan. And at that time, we were there with former Speaker Newt Gingrich and Congressman Andy Biggs and Congressman Ted Yoho, who was at the time the chairman of the subcommittee for Asia and the Pacific. And Mrs. Moon made a similar, in a sense, an advanced declaration that we were now in an era of the Asia-Pacific civilization, and she called for the formation of an Asia-Pacific Union that would be based upon those universal values that are so well rooted in Asia, of family values, filial piety, etc., things like that. And we had rich discussions with Speaker Gingrich and the two congressmen and others. The reason I bring those stories up is I think that there's a lot to learn from what they're talking about that frames the bigger issues. It's a bigger frame to look at the issues that are facing us today, especially with the Korean Peninsula. But you know, in getting ready for the program today, I took a look at one of the newsletter feeds I get, Cipher Brief, and just to accent how hot the situation is right now with China, is in today's brief, you have a story of US senators calling for sanctions over the Apple Daily closure, a 25-year great reputable newspaper, digital organization. Senators Pat Toomey and Chris Van Hollen did a letter to President Biden dealing with the issue that China has closed down that news company. Can you imagine if all of a sudden Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post was put in jail and the reporters were not allowed to go in the building? That's what's happened in Hong Kong to some of the media there. That's just Hong Kong. But then you go down to another speech that was given just recently by the Chinese Defense Ministry that made the statement that Taiwan's future lies in reunification. Taiwan's future existence depends on reunification with the mainland. Same day, another speech from a US director of the Institute on Taiwan. Taiwan no longer is an issue in Chinese relations. Kind of painting the picture that everything's fine, that we're going to continue to work with Taiwan. We're not going to keep a blind eye to it, which is very good. And then on the same day, Japan speaks out. The Japan defense minister says that Taiwan is linked to Japan's security. The reason I bring this up in terms of Taiwan and China, obviously China is critical to the Korean Peninsula. But watching what's going on geopolitically is getting so tense, and America's role is so vital, which is why how we frame the view of the Pacific region is so critical. A couple weeks ago, we had a similar ILC like this, and I was a pleasure to be on there as a speaker. And we had a couple of experts, economic experts. One, Steve Kalia from Australia, who publishes the Peace Index every year. He's an economist, a very accomplished digital entrepreneur who puts about $3 million a year into a think tank. And he does this Peace Index that demonstrates the connection between economies, societies that are free and economies that grow. And Steve made the point that for the Korea unification to occur, the economic justification, the economic rationale is the best way to bring that about. I agree with him. There was another expert from India that works in Seoul, made the same point. And that's why we're so happy with UPF, with Dr. Jenkins and others, to have formed this International Association for Peace and Economic Development to bring the realm of economy and business and trade to the table with the Korean Peninsula. With that, in closing, another important element in this big macro framework is these different associations that the UPF has developed in business, media, academia, the arts, and of course, elected officials. Congressman Dan Burton and John Doolittle, of course, have done an exceptional job with Dr. Jenkins. I think there's over 7,000 incumbent members of Parliament and Congress tied to this now, working on these peace issues in 150 countries. Imagine with that network, which is starting to work now, starts to put pressure and create a common voice. And then you have heads of state, and you have an interreligious side. It's all the different organs of society, if you will, growing a global network of experts like on this panel. That's resulting now in the Think Tank 2022. So what I'd like to leave you with is the concept here that new strategies, innovation is coming out of the civil society arena. And there is a lot that we can do to make a difference. And what you can do for all of those, thank you for joining in all of our audience today, is get involved with UPF if you're not already. Whatever field you're interested in, there's a place for you. And we would be so grateful to be involved. Thanks so much for giving me a chance to share, Congressman Doolittle, and God bless everybody.
Thank you very much. Well, now is our time to get into discussion. And I'd like to throw something out. China is built up as the 800-pound gorilla of the world. You know, they have faster economic growth than everybody else, several times what other nations have sometimes. I'd like to know what their weaknesses are. What are their challenges? What are their vulnerabilities? Since we're talking about economic and political realities in Northeast Asia, let's talk about the biggest influence in Northeast Asia and the rest of Asia.
If I can actually take
Yes,
the first stab. So it seems very cliched, but there is a limit to authoritarian rule. And so that this planned economy model that China has pursued, state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfers, and the like, have worked for China to date. They have very ambitious plans too. Central bank digital currency plans, this whole idea of politicizing development assistance strategies through the Belt and Road Initiative in a way to curry favor and to actually, have a lot of checkbook diplomacy. So we can come through this whole list of what makes it strong. But I believe that it's actually hitting a wall. Planned economies, if not planned right, have great difficulties readjusting the course. And I think one of the biggest good examples of that is going to be the population crisis that China is having. So in a way to become more competitive, it introduced this draconian one-child policy in the 70s. We've seen that it has actually worked too well. and you're seeing depopulation in China. And over the last decade, China has loosened that stance and said, well, okay, you can have 2 now. This year, they're saying you can have 3. But people don't necessarily want 3 kids, right? And of course, the problem with demographics is that you don't instantaneously have more people. The people are not widgets. It takes at least 18 years. And I would argue that it takes probably much more than that for anyone to become a productive member of society. And hopefully after a certain age, teenagers actually do grow up. But the point being that plans can work, but they hit a wall. And I also think the strength of the United States is to be able to self-correct. And it is doing so in a big way right now. Congressman Stearns pointed out the Innovation and Competition Act that is gaining a lot of support both from the Democrats and the Republicans. This whole idea of taking a more aggressive stance towards China has had bipartisan support. But not only that, it's actually leading to steps, concrete actions for the United States, not just to define what the Chinese threat is, but to actually get its own house in order, to not be so complacent, and to actually invest in its own research capabilities, in its own industrial bases, and in its own people as well. Now, the challenge, of course, is that the very nature of democracy can be a double-edged sword. China, in its favor, has time in its favor. It can plan out 5-10 years from now. In a democracy, we do face that challenge of having to reverse course when there is a change in administration or there is a change in the government roadmap. That said, I believe that there is this there is national solidarity about US, the extraordinary development that the United States has enjoyed over the economic front cannot be taken for granted. There are certain industries, especially in the services sector, that need to be protected. If they are not protected, they will be violated against. And so there are measures that are being put into place. And the strength of America today, too, is that it is willing and really reaching out to its partners as well to work together. Just one thing, if I may, as an Asian living in the United States, one of the things that I hope the United States will address very well is this issue about racial equity. This whole idea of Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate has really garnered a lot of attention in the Asian media, not just in the Chinese state media. There has been a lot of concern about the United States, Asians actually feeling safe in the United States. I'm hoping that this hostility towards China that we have at this stage will not actually spill over into xenophobia and further attacks to the Asians community in the United States, and also aggravate US relations with its Asian partners as well. Done right, it can actually be a strength of the United States. It will demonstrate the United States' ability to have strength in its diversity, strength in its plurality, but it really does, it is like a garden. It does need to be tended to and carefully cultivated. So.
You mentioned the population problem, which is they're not growing fast enough for people, but they have a tremendously aging population, I understand. It's going to become an increasing burden for them, and they're going to need new workers. Also, because of apparently the strong ethnic preference for males over females, the restriction on children has resulted in a shortage of brides for the Chinese men, I understand. So do you see China trying to bring people in to be their new workers or to be the marriage material for the grooms? What do you think about that?
Not to hog the conversation, but yes, certainly there has been this deficit of eligible women. It is, and also the standards for men to actually be able to get a bride is incredibly high. You're supposed to be able to provide housing before you get married. And of course, if you are living in a large metropolitan area like Shanghai or Beijing, it's next to impossible to be able to get an apartment anytime soon. They also have registration limitations, so that you have to have the paperwork to actually stay in the big cities. And if you don't have that, you are not able to have some of the more lucrative jobs in China, and you actually are born into opportunity, or you're not simply by the place that you are born. So there is this demographic challenge in terms of the male to female imbalance, the lack of opportunities, or the big growing divide between the coastal areas and the rural areas. Will it lead to import of brides, as we've seen in some parts of Asia, to deal with the population crisis? That is really not going to be the case. We've seen that the dominant demographic in China is the Han Chinese. Of course, we've seen the oppression of the Uyghurs, the oppression of the Tibetans is very much a story that we've all been following for decades. And then we also have the oppression of the Hong Kong Chinese as well. So there isn't a lot of willingness to import brides or encourage that kind of diversity from within. So they're actually kind of locking themselves into a straitjacket.
Which
Hey,
means,
John, go ahead.
yes, Congressman Stearns, jump in.
Well, John, I was just going to say, you asked, what are the, when you compare China and the United States, how does China have weaknesses? And I would say symbolically, look at the pandemic. Would you rather have a vaccine from China or a vaccine from the United States?
Well, you mentioned COVID, but let's talk about that. What do we know about the impact of COVID on China? I mean, it certainly had a huge impact on every other country. What's its impact there?
Well, it seems like they were able to control it, it appears, although we don't know all the information, but at least it didn't seem to be rampant in Shanghai or Beijing or some of the other large cities, whereas in New York and Miami and Atlanta, it was. But the point I was trying to make is that I think the United States was very quick in putting together a vaccine through Pfizer and Moderna, which was effective almost 95, 96%. And it's worked, and it's brought the pandemic under control, notwithstanding the possibility of the Delta vaccine variants. But the point is that China took their vaccine and exported it to a lot of African countries, and it was not as effective as the Moderna or the Pfizer. So I think if you look at symbolically, a free market in terms of its research, and as pointed out earlier, that this ability for innovation and imagination is very keen to the United States free enterprise system. So with this new bill that passed by the Senate, they had a whole new research in artificial intelligence, quantum information, robotics, including producing semiconductors for the country. And so I think if the United States is able to continue its innovation and through free enterprise, it ultimately will create new products which will be superior to what could be done in a centralized economy.
Well, those are excellent points. And let me, you mentioned something I want to ask you about, because I think this is kind of in your area. I read that the, what's it called? The Taiwan Semiconductor Company, I may not have the name exactly right, but I read that they make 90% of the world's supply of the most sophisticated think of
Semiconductor
chips,
Microchip.
Semiconductor.
The microprocessors, 90%. That worries me as somebody knowing that little Taiwan is sitting right there, and the aggressive communist China keeps making threatening statements about it. But Taiwan, of course, is a free country, and you know they've had this amazing accomplishment. Just going forward, I don't know, what's your sense, Congressman, on the on whether that situation holds? Are we going to try and have more of these sophisticated chips in the United States, or will China try and grab that?
Yes, we're going to see. I'll tell you the honest truth, John. the iPhone is going to be replaced someday. It's going to be replaced by the Google goggles. I don't know if you're aware with the Google goggles, but they're eventually going to be a contact lens that you put in your eyes, in which you'll have holographics, three-dimensional, and it'll be tied to a computer, and you can turn it off, on and off, and the entire technology will be in your eyes, and you won't be looking down at a computer, and it'll be voice dictation. So between the voice dictation and artificial intelligence and the whole thing into a contact lens as thin as a vapor size of a contact, that kind of technology is already being presented here in the United States. I've done several lectures on it to college students, and I show the progression of these Google glasses that have occurred. And so the reason I point this out is because I think the United States is an area of highly innovation. And I think with this new bill that we passed, it's $250 billion, setting up all these research centers, I think it's going to be helpful for the United States in its competition with China.
How many years away are we from those contact lenses? Have you heard? You know, is there an estimate?
They said 5 to 10 years. Now, at first, people were, you know, if you ever had a contact lens,
I don't like contact lenses, by the
I'm
way.
wearing some right now.
But the contact lens is going to be so different than the contact lens that you're using today. It's going to be, you can sleep with it, you never have to take it out, and it's not going to be any kind of nuisance to you or affect your eye, the oculus of your eye. So it's going to be transformative. So it's really, it's hard to believe, but the iPhone someday will be replaced, just like the turntable photograph, as well as the CDs are now being replaced with iTunes.
Well, I hear that's coming, and you've just reinforced it. So thank you.
John, I'd like to jump in.
Yes.
Let me jump in here real quick. To go back to the question of vulnerabilities or weaknesses of the People's Republic of China, I think, of course, the power rests in the Communist Party. The heart of that is an ideology, a frame of mind, a set of ideas and principles that govern what they do. And I think that a great vulnerability has occurred because of the aggressiveness of China with its expansion all over the world, Africa, Latin America, of course. The One Belt and Road, of course, initiative has been huge, but the debt trapping and the blowback that's occurring, the pushback that's occurring from countries that have taken, have been advantaged by China's investments, but when they see the controls that are involved, are beginning to push back. A big turning point, I think, that Chihoko mentioned was the fact that the G7 came out in alliance with the Biden administration in terms of resisting China. So it's become job number one on the global level, in my view, geopolitically, that it's not unlike, in a sense, the fears that were beginning to emerge before World War, or during World War II, the rise of Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan. I think the world is waking up, and because of the communications, instantaneous communications, everybody can see what's going on. So I think that is an inherent vulnerability for China, their aggressiveness, communications, and the goodwill of freedom-loving people. I think it also raises the challenge to America, and going back to also what Chihoko addressed in terms of the social concerns and moral concerns within our country. I think it's vital for America and freedom-loving countries to develop a voice and a narrative that can win the argument. Is it Chinese? Is it socialism with Chinese characteristics that creates this amazing economy under a state-governed economy? Or is it free markets and morally guided people that can create a healthy society? I think it's a battle of ideas in that sense. And the role of groups like UPF and others, and the role of the media is so critical in that regard. So I think that issue is also a vulnerability with China. It's also a vulnerability in the West, which we have to measure up to.
Well, on that point, I don't feel our people understand anything about communism and Marxism and fascism, for that matter. I think younger people today barely even understand the issues at play that led the whole world to go to war in World War II, which is we have tremendous effects from that even to this day in the relationships, especially in Northeast Asia. But my question is, do you think we ought to be teaching people what is Marxism, what is communism, why are they evil, why do they hurt people, how many millions and millions of people have been murdered by communists in the 20th century and are still being tortured and killed in places like North Korea and communist China and Cuba and to lesser degrees in other authoritarian countries?
Well, I think the answer to that, I can start the conversation with everybody, is absolutely that education needs to take place on lots of fronts, including the faith community. Governor DeSantis, of course, has just, I think, put a bill out there or a law in Florida about addressing the evils of those kinds of ideologies. But I do think it's a battle for hearts and minds, and it's incumbent upon America, especially Americans, to lead the way.
We've got a Marxist group like Black Lives Matter that's promoting critical race theory, and that's being pushed throughout schools throughout the country, which is totally based on Marxism, pitting people against each other. And, this is the United States. Here, China is building up its military, and we're just sitting here fighting amongst ourselves over falsehoods that are being promoted by some of the most influential media in the United States and most influential political figures.
I actually think the best way to tell the story of the dangers of communism and the dangers of the Chinese Communist Party in particular would be to tell the stories of people who've actually left it. So one of the most ardent supporters of the Republican Party or of the biggest patriots in the United States are those who've left Cuba, who've left China, who've left communist Europe. And we talk about, Holocaust survivors telling their, witnesses to the horrors of the Holocaust. In a similar vein, I think we could really celebrate and encourage people to speak up what it was like to live under communist rule in China, what the Castro regime was like in Cuba, why they left, and why life is so much better here. And I think that actually gives us, because one of the left of center people would argue is that, well, the United States is not without its faults, and we need to hear the stories of those who aren't mainstream United States. But similarly, we actually do need to hear those stories of those minorities, those different American stories, and the different past immigration and being part of the American fabric as well.
If I may,
yes,
John, I think one phenomenon, picking exactly on this point that Chihoko mentioned, is the defectors from North Korea,
right?
Some 30,000, 35,000 strong. And what I'm observing is the phenomenon of the millennial generation and Generation X, young people from their 20s to their mid 30s who are educated, who come out from North Korea, who are becoming vocal. One big one that got big news this last week was Yeonmi Park, a young lady, I think in her late 20s, an author of a book. And she went to Columbia, studied there, but was on Hannity and was on Laura Ingraham. But she's got something like 500,000 people that follow her on YouTube. And she does extraordinary reports about life inside North Korea. I see a phenomenon going on of a potential global movement of young people who see the inadequacy in North Korea and want to do something about it to help from a humanitarian or freedom-loving standpoint. So I think Chiyoko's exactly right. Defectors from there, from China, from other places, they have a very important voice, and I think we could do more to help expand them.
Well, I think we would strengthen ourselves in this fight with China, which is really a war. It's just not being fought with weapons, but it's a war.
That's right.
It's serious. They're determined to defeat us. And I'd like to ask you, you said something, Chihoko, earlier about this new digital currency that China is developing. Is it their intent to try and replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Is that what is behind this project of theirs with their digital currency?
I think it actually has two purposes. One is to make it more efficient. We already are using a lot of credit cards, and the digital currency does make sense. It makes it efficient. But the central bank issued digital currencies adds greater layers of control that the Chinese are not shying away from using. One is that they can actually track exactly where it's being spent, their money, and they can withhold payment as well. And as you probably are familiar, they have a social credit score on each individual. And your pay could be docked through the central bank currency scheme. And you actually exert even greater control on the actions and even the thoughts of people who would be paid by the yuan. And then the second one, Congressman Doolittle, is what you've discussed. So one of the things that the Chinese want to do with this digital currency is to, when the Chinese give out loans to African nations or to Southeast Asia or wherever, it would be denominated in yuan through the digital currency, and they would have no choice but to use this payment system. And that in turn would actually increase the value and the need and the spaces that the yuan can be used. And if it can't be converted into other currencies, they're kind of locked into that space as well. So yeah, there is a lot of concern about that.
Well, as a follow-up to all of you, it seems to me we have this incredible power of being the world's reserve currency. Of course, we can spend and spend and spend seemingly without consequence until now we've got inflation roaring along, seemingly. So that's a consequence. But I mean, it is amazing how much debt we've racked up over the years with seemingly very little direct consequence. But there's another power. I mean, we actually can affect policy by controlling whether banks can accept transactions and things. I'm wondered, why don't we use this more than in fact we do?
Well, John, the central bank is in a sort of a catch-22. Yellen and all those people sound pretty, when I hear them talk, John, they sound pretty political. They're trying to back up the Biden agenda. So they don't want to increase the interest rate, notwithstanding the fact that you just point out inflation is starting to move forward. In fact, some people on Wall Street are saying it's actually 12%. Wow. I know in Florida, houses have gone up more than 12% in the last 3 months. They've gone up 25 or 30%. So the political side of it is that some of these officials supporting Biden do not want to, one, disrupt the economy, because you saw that some of the Federal Reserve Board branches were talking about increasing interest rate, and the stock market dropped 500 points. So it's a catch-22 for these political appointees. But really, Yellen should be separate, and that's her job, to be separate from the administration and think about all of Americans and how to keep the economy sound by not keeping the interest rate artificially low, which means that we're going to have inflation.
Yeah, 12%. That was, didn't we have 12.5% at the height of the inflation in the early 1980s?
Yeah, well, under Jimmy Carter, yeah. I had a mortgage of 13% on one of my commercial properties. It was a killer because, 13% means money doubles almost every 4 years. 4 or 5
what
years.
About the switching topics? I'm trying to respond to some of these questions. What happens if the United States doesn't join, like the TPP or the other one, the
RCEP.
It seemed like, I know President Trump didn't want to join that, and I'm a big fan of President Trump. But I sensed that if we'd been part of that, we would have had more influence over what the Chinese communists are doing, in the world, and we're not part of it. Maybe we're going to be now in this administration. But tell me, what do you think the effect would be if we remain apart, as opposed to joining?
Well, in terms of the U.S. economy itself, it's not that big a deal, quite frankly. So the United States already has bilateral agreements with Mexico, Canada. It's got one with Japan now. And in terms of adding to US GDP, back then, 5 years ago, it was only supposed to add about 1 percentage point to the US GDP, which isn't chump change, but it's not going to revolutionize the US economy. What it does, though, is give greater credibility to US economic leadership. The Biden administration people, though, are quite aware of the difficulties, even within the Democratic Party, to push through new trade agreements. And so they argue that, well, we've got this new corporate tax issue going. We've got, we can do smaller issue by issue trade deals. We can do unilateral deals instead of signing on to big trade deals. That should be sufficient to cover the economic side and also for the United States to not backtrack on its words about working together with its allies. So in a nutshell, there are bigger issues right now to deal with than trying to reduce trade barriers and trade tariffs. But at the same time, it's a new landscape out there about digital trade, about cross-border transactions. And there needs to be clarity in the wild, wild west. And the United States should be in there, if only to be the sheriff and to make sure that its own interests are being met in that space.
John, I just would point out that there's a Quad, the grouping of 4 democracies, which is India, Australia, US, and Japan, known as a Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad. And this is an agreement between democracies to help themselves. And it's not so much anti-China as it's a coalition of 4 members who are trying to promote economies within themselves. So I think that the trade agreement that both Biden is against and Trump was against, and Hillary Clinton, when she ran for president, was against, did seem to have bipartisan feeling that it's not in the best interest of the United States. But I think this Quad is a very good situation for America to support.
Yes, that sounds very encouraging, and I'm glad that it's been formed and is active. Let me just ask the 4 of you, or the 3 of you, rather, me included, but Hong Kong. We've seen freedoms being systematically destroyed in Hong Kong, and other than a few hand wringings, nothing seems to be stopping it. Are they just going to be taken into the communist dictatorship like the rest of the country, and that's it?
Yeah, it's
Well, I
painful
think
to
Tom,
see. Or go ahead, Congressman.
No, Tom, you go ahead, because you hit on it when you talked about Hong Kong, how they shut that newspaper down.
Well, I just watching the news of the imprisonment of Jimmy Lee and Lai, whatever his name is, and the publisher, and the shutting down of the Apple Daily. It's just so scary to see what's happening. Of course, behind that was the legislative changes that occurred in the Hong Kong government. I'm not familiar in detail, but just in watching the news reports, laws were changed. Parties that advocated for freedom were cut down and knocked out of place. And I think it's the fearful point is to see the trend going on in Hong Kong translated or transferred over to Taiwan. I think people are watching that. Fortunately, I think the U.S. military, the Navy, put some ships over there recently near the Taiwan Strait. I'm glad to see President Biden's administration dealing with this. I think that's been very good. I think President Moon's visit to the U.S., as well as Prime Minister Suga's visit, just weeks ago, I think those are very important. But I think that the Hong Kong situation is a sign of what could happen. And fortunately, I think the world is waking up to push back.
Well, I think as Tom pointed out, this Apple Daily, they froze all the assets. They arrested the editor and the people involved, shut it down. And it was the last pro-democracy newspaper in the entire country. Now think if China got
yesterday.
Yeah. And just think if China got a hold of Taiwan, what would happen? And so that is sort of a harbinger for all of us to think about. What's happening in Hong Kong could happen in Taiwan if we somehow let the Chinese influence and political proactiveness isolate Taiwan. But I think the Biden administration should go to the UN and complain, because the agreement that was made between the British and the Chinese did not include shutting down pro-democracy newspapers like the Apple Daily. So I think the administration should make a hell of a fuss about this, because it's really going not against the grain of democracy, but going against the grain of free speech.
Well, I agree, but there seems to be no consequence. The Chinese do whatever they like. I say the Chinese, China was a free country after World War II. And they suffered terribly under the terrible atrocities of Imperial Japan. And then the murderous Mao Zedong and the communists came along and took over the country. I'm sure the Chinese would love to get rid of communism. They're under the boot more than anyone, really. And it's tragic. And now to see them doing all these things is deeply disturbing to me. And we need to talk more about this.
I think it's all the more important that the work of IAPP, the Parliamentarian Network that you're heading up in North America, Congressman Doolittle, is vital. And here's why. Related to Taiwan is the absolutely essential relation between Japan and Taiwan, evidenced by the defense minister who just, he gave an interview with Bloomberg, Nobuo Kishi, said Tokyo's security is linked to Taiwan's, and expressed concern over the military balance between China and Taiwan shifting towards Beijing. My point here is the US alliance with Japan is so vital. And thank goodness, I understand Congressman Burton did a program with the Japanese Diet, some 50 members of the Diet, an IAPP sponsored program. I'm sure Cliff and Shioko could add a lot of value to that. Strengthening that relation between the US and Japan for all the right reasons. The same with South Korea. Helping to mend the Korea-Japan situation is so important. Keeping our relationship with Taiwan, along with the Quad. I think it's the name of the game is looking at the world as a family of nations. We have some severe family problems. We have one creator, one God, one source of real universal values. And the world needs a new 21st century vision, where we're united together as a family of nations for all the right reasons. And so that's what I think. I think America's is a vital role, and I'm so grateful for the work of UPF and to be part of that.
Well, and thank you for re-emphasizing. I was very pleased to hear about the link between Japan and Taiwan. I take that as a real note of encouragement. We have less than 2 minutes to go. Would anybody like to share one final insight? Or two final insights?
How about each of us could? Each of us should say something.
Good. All right.
Well, I think we go ahead. I would just quickly say what the Universal Peace Federation and the Washington Times is doing through their foundation is paramount here. And what Tom just mentioned is what Reverend Moon has been most of his life was trying to do. And I think that there's got to be a realization by mankind that our very survivals depend upon us working together as a group of nations, rather than continually fighting as we're doing in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and other parts of the Mideast. Because in the end, the time the human being, Homo sapiens, have been on this earth is very short time compared to, for example, other species, including the dinosaurs. So the sooner we get to realize that our survivals depend upon working together, the better off we'll be.
Thank you. 30 seconds.
There's renewed faith in American leadership and in American innovation and this American creativity. That's the upside of COVID, I think. It's up to the United States now to actually move forward with that positive momentum to deliver on those expectations. There are a lot of hurdles, but I do think there is a lot of political will, and we've seen that already in this banding together against China. And I think that could be a force that could be propel even further innovation and further cooperation.
Thank you. Final word, Tom?
I think I'm grateful so much to be part of this again, and thanks to Dr. Jenkins and his great team for putting these programs together. And I understand this program happening in North America is also happening this week, today down in South America, 6 hours ahead of us over in Europe. Africa's doing theirs next week, and Asia's already started. So these programs like this going on all over the place. And I think that the Think Tank 2022 concept is fantastic. And I think we all ought to pay attention to that and get involved. I know all of you would be very much welcome in that. Imagine the brain power and the moral, spiritual power and the civilization influence of a couple thousand experts in these different areas that orbit around the common values of interdependence and mutual prosperity and universal values. It really could be a civilization level force, I think. I think we're beginning to see that. So thanks very much for having us.
Thank you. It's been an excellent discussion. I'm grateful to all of our three panelists for the insights you shared, and we are a little bit over time. So until next time, we shall regroup again. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.